Welcome to the Pastor's Connection podcast, where we delve into the heart of ministry and explore the challenges and triumphs of pastoral life. Join us as we connect with inspiring leaders, share insightful stories, and equip one another with tools for effective ministry. Together, we can foster a community of support, encouragement, and growth in our calling. I am your host, Thomas Osterkamp, and I lead Beachside Community Church here in Palm Coast, Florida, and I help lead the Pastor's Connection Network. Today's episode is brought to you by Family Meeting. The Family Meeting exists to help you have the meaningful relationships that you desire in your marriage and family. Along with the podcast, Thomas and Lysandra offer books, devotionals, as well as speaking at marriage retreats and conferences, providing real, practical help for ministry families. Contact them at info@familymeeting.org to help the marriages and families in your church grow stronger today. Today's episode, we have Josh Hershberger here with us. He is the executive director and general counsel at the Good Citizen Project. You'll be hearing more about that as well as all the other things that Josh is involved in. Just want to say thanks for being on the podcast today, Josh. I appreciate you.
That's great to join you. Looking forward to the conversation today.
So today we're going to be talking about some of the biggest legal challenges facing churches today. So this is one of those things where when I was called to preach and become a pastor, legal issues weren't anywhere in the forefront of my mind. And so I don't know that many of us thought about that much, but I'm thankful to have people like you that we can call when there are issues that need to be dealt with.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve the church in this way. And anyone that leads a church knows that it's essentially leading a large, small business in a sense. There's the payroll issues, the liability, the insurance, and then you have religious liberty issues on top, a changing culture. Church leadership is hard enough, and then you layer in some of these things, and it can be truly overwhelming. And so we're grateful to be able to come alongside pastors and generally just try to equip them to be confident in these areas so that it's not a distraction and they can get back to the ministry of the word and ministering to folks. So that's how we often look at our ministry, just providing confidence and preventing distraction in this space. So we're grateful for the opportunity to serve.
You talk about the business aspect of it, and I don't know how many times I've heard pastors say, well, the church isn't a business. And I'm like, no, it isn't. But if you don't do things legally correct, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble. So you need to make sure that you know what you're doing. Before we jump into the conversation, though, Josh, can you just kind of introduce your family to us, give a little insight on who you are personally?
Yes, my wife and I met at college at Pensacola Christian, just celebrated 18 years of marriage, truly a partner in ministry. Though God has given us different giftings, she kind of exists, kind of her personal mission statement to shine the light of Jesus through music and speech, helps teach drama at a Christian school, leads student ministries at our church. We recently at a conference, national conference on Christian citizenship, though had a chance to lead worship together. And so she led worship, I helped. And many of the people came up to us afterwards like, hey, Josh and Harrison, our deputy director, we were up there too. And like, oh, you guys are doing such a great job supporting the ladies. In the sense my wife was leading, our teenage daughter also loves music. So that was a really fun opportunity to minister together. And then we have a teenage daughter, as I mentioned, in high school, and then a 6-year-old son. And one of the joys for me this summer, because my wife led Vacation Bible School, she asked me, what was your highlight? And it was our 6-year-old, who's a little bit more reserved in his personality, joining on stage to help lead worship during Vacation Bible School. And he was into it,
Nice.
Wonder Junction, many churches use some of the Answers in Genesis curriculum there. So it really is a fun season in life to be able to do ministry together. So we're grateful for that.
Yeah, I'm always amazed at families who are kind of musically inclined. My wife and I will speak together, and we do so often, but you're never going to find us singing together. So one of our daughters, she's on our worship team, and there's times where I hear her sing, and I'm like, where did you get that voice? Because that did not come from me at all.
Different giftings in the body, right?
Most definitely, most definitely. But it's cool when you see families kind of serving together. So you talk about church and some of the things you've got going on there. Can you share just a little bit about your church background, and then we'll talk about law and all those qualifications and things that you're doing as well?
Sure. So grew up as a pastor's kid, and that may explain some of the strangeness or weirdness that you may experience listening to this podcast. I think I survived that. But
Yeah.
I did grow up in a pastor's home. My dad moved around the country a good bit, often in struggling ministries. Saw a lot of hardship early on, including church splits and my parents' names being slandered, but also just consistently received sound Bible preaching, and even from my parents, look to Jesus. People will fail you, pointing to the scriptures, and so I will be forever grateful for that emphasis. But also, from the very beginning, was seeing the difficult side of church leadership. You come in, you preach, you lead. You think that would be sufficient, but then you have people that have lifted up the prior pastor on a pedestal, and maybe there's Jesus and then him, and who cares what you're going to do? And just saw the problems of even not properly organizing a ministry and how that could break down over time as a new pastor comes in. But also just the opportunity to help fulfill the Great Commission. I also early on felt a tug into Christian citizenship. And I thought, well, I need to go to law school to be able to do that. So I ended up going to Pensacola and ended up getting a scholarship to go to law school in Michigan. And I've always felt a dual call to ministry in kind of the more traditional, maybe not vocational sense, but still preaching once a month on Sunday morning, helping with small groups and discipleship, but then to become an attorney and to work in the public square. So law school in Michigan, and then I have served since law school at the same church as essentially a teaching pastor. Actually preaching through the book of Acts right now on Sunday mornings. Cool. It's been such a rich study. Now, I preach about 3 weeks. I'm out somewhere else preaching about biblical citizenship or biblical worldview. But then I just love that one Sunday to come back and just get into the Word, preaching verse by verse through the book of Acts. And one of the teens joked with me, I think last month, like, well, hey, Josh, when you get done, you can just start over because we've all forgotten, Acts 1, because it's about a 2-year, process to get through them all. Yep. But that has continued to, I think, keep me rooted and grounded in the Word of God, which is something that can happen in public life. You get pushed and pulled by so many different forces, some of them well-meaning, some of them even, I think, driven by the enemy, but sure. Just remaining focused on the church as God's plan A. There is no plan B. Sometimes it is a messy group of people, but that is how God's and Christ said, "Hey, this is how it's going to change the world." So, I'm grateful for that opportunity. Might not work other places, but we're just appreciative of the opportunity to continue to serve there.
Yeah, which is so fantastic. And we actually just a couple episodes ago. We're talking about how to raise pastors' kids who love the church. And so I always find it so fascinating when you have a pastor's kid who is still so passionate about the church and about helping not just their own local church, but the body of Christ as a whole and other pastors and ministries to continue to serve in the most effective ways. So I think that's really cool. And it's great that your pastor takes advantage of the talents and the gifts that God has given to you while he can. So you went to law school. Can you just kind of share, I know Citizen Project and I think the Church Ambassador Network as well. Can you explain some of those things and then, where you're licensed and all that kind of stuff?
Sure. So when I came out of law school, I had, over the next maybe year or two, kind of two realizations. One was culture was changing quickly. So I came to law school in 2011. Very quickly, the Defense of Marriage Act fell, and then the Obergefell case in 2015 enshrined same-sex marriage as the law of the land, and then just a kind of a flood. And so this was all, it was a legal decision, but it signified, I think, steep cultural change. And so I came out thinking perhaps America was headed in a different direction. Wow, things have changed quickly. And I heard a lot of, hey, we win in the end. And amen to that.
Yeah,
but
we
what
do,
I
yes.
what I did not hear much of was a game plan. I kind of felt like I was sticking my fingers, mixing a few metaphors here, but kind of sticking my fingers in the holes in a dike and running out of available digits as we were litigating cases, trying to help churches. And so it's kind of like, well, where's the strategy? Where's the 20 to 30 year strategy for our citizenship in the United States, for the rights of churches? And we know that that's not ultimate, right? The church is going to continue and flourish because Christ said that the gates of hell is not going to prevail against it. Yes. However, we have this unique opportunity in our role as citizen in the United States. We have the First Amendment, we have religious freedom, we have tax exemption, we have free speech. These are blessings that have encouraged the Christian church throughout our nation's history, and I think that's worth more than a shrug. And so it's kind of, well, where are we going to go? What's the strategy moving forward? And so in and around 2014, 2015, I joined forces with a couple of other attorneys to launch what is now the Good Citizen Project. The idea being to provide, legal services to churches, to encourage them to have a strong legal foundation so that they then can be confident to get back to their work, but also to help educate believers. And this was the other piece or realization that I came to, and that was when I saw Christians engaging in the public square, I saw people engaging in politics like everyone else. And the way that I saw ministry being done in my local church was very different than the way ministry was being done in the public square. And here I was, the young attorney, who am I supposed to the emperor has no clothes, I'm the young guy. Who am I to tell these people that have been around the block? And again, many of the organizations in public life have been doing great work for a long time, but there are a number of tensions. There's a two-party system in the United States that can push and pull Christians. Going political rhetoric. I don't think when you go into public life that the fruits of the Spirit get thrown out the door, and you don't see that much. And so I just became increasingly convinced that Christians were being discipled in their role as citizen by social media, the parties, how grandma and grandpa did politics, but not by the Word of God. And if we are called as Christians to follow Jesus in every area of our lives, I would argue that includes our role as citizen. And so we set out through preaching, through the Good Citizen study guide, so a small group series, and then podcasting, just trying to think differently about how would we, as Christians, how can we effectively, practically engage in this role? And so that's the heart of the Good Citizen Project. Now, as I was working on this, I have committed in my life, and it is a struggle sometimes. I think we all can wrestle with ego and try to be the Philippians 2, servant leader like Jesus, but I've tried to commit to not allowing titles to be that big of a deal. But to value impact over titles, or I have to be the president of everything I'm a part of or something. I discovered in my work that there was an existing network of 40 state-based focused on the family-affiliated ministries. And so the one there in Florida be Florida Voice, here, Indiana Family Institute, and saw an opportunity to join forces as many of those organizations were thinking through this question of, are we ministering with the church or are we ministering around the church? And we're called to pray for our governing officials. It's hard to do that if you don't know who they are, what they care about. And so a recommitment to, 1 Timothy 2, pray for those that are in authority. And as pastors, when a pastor steps into the State House or even into the White House, he does so not as, with an R or a D behind his name, but as an ambassador of a different kingdom. And that is not just quibbling about morality or moral equivalency. It is literally, we represent the kingdom of God. And we bring that to bear in public life. And saw a real opportunity there. We, just this last session, and I would say I'm a part of a church-led, state-based strategy for renewing America. We had over 1,200 connections in between pastors and governing officials, praying for them, asking how they're doing, asking how can we partner with you in the public square, and then how can we pray for you. And that's led to some really incredible partnerships in the area of, say, foster care or addiction recovery, And then those connections lead to good public policy. So I can explain a little bit more of how that all kind of fits together later. But I look at it as, in a sense, kind of a Nehemiah strategy. That on one hand, you do have to defend.
Right.
The state may attempt to infringe on religious freedom, as we'll discuss. But on the other hand, we have this really incredible moment right now in our country due to the social crises we see around us, breakdown of the family, etc. Government budgets are shrinking. Supreme Court precedent has opened the door for better partnership between church and state. So we really have this remarkable opportunity to kind of serve our way back into the city, the center of our cities. So that's what the work in Indiana, partnered now with 20 other states across the country, is all about. But they fit hand in glove in the sense that we want to work first in our local church. Out of an outgrowth of that, we then impact our state, and that then impacts the country. So that's a little bit of the strategy we're working on.
That's great. And I love that. And I think about Paul himself, who, he took full advantage of his citizenship. And I think that we have the responsibility to do that as well. But a lot of times it's either we're too busy, because I know most pastors of most churches are pastoring very small churches, and which means the pastor has to do almost everything, and then you add keeping track of all the political stuff on one hand, and then you've got people the other extreme. It's like all they do is politics, and they kind of forget about the church side as well. So having people like you and organizations like the Good Citizen Project to help us out, I think is such a great thing, such a great partnership to have. Go ahead.
Well, and I can lay this out a little bit more. My hope is, when I talk to a pastor about this topic, is I certainly don't want to start another program, and I really don't want to give you something more to do. My hope is that what we're encouraging folks to do in the public square actually fits into the disciple-making program of their church that's already there. Whether it's adding to small group, topics, we talk about how to be a good employee, we talk about finances. Well, why are we ceding to the world or to the parties discipling folks in the area of citizenship? But even then, for the pastor, I encourage a lot of Christians to invert their political attention. So you think about how much Christians think about Washington, D.C., and that's important. The Fox News, CNN, and you check all that, and it's important to stay up to date. Please hear me. I think that's important. But how much does the average American Christian, how much power does the average American Christian have to change anything that goes on in D.C.? You can write a letter, you can vote, you can run for office yourself, but beyond that, there's not a lot.
Yeah.
Now think about your own zip code. And think about going and praying with your mayor, running for school board. And so I would say for most Christians, we're going to have our greatest impact in our own zip code. So my encouragement to pastors to think about, you are a pastor not just to your church, but to the city. And you think about the church in the book of Acts. I mean, it is a city, right? You're ministering to those folks. Well, your state rep and your state senator are members of that community. And so I think politics was looked at as something else, like it's something other. Yeah. It's another topic I've got to think about. But I think from Scripture, and you mentioned the Apostle Paul, Acts 16, he uses citizenship to protect the reputation of the church he started. Acts 21, he uses his citizenship to protect himself, but also to gain audience. He has the Roman soldiers come and guard him while he preaches to the Jewish mob. And then he appeals to Caesar and uses his citizenship to take the gospel to the center of the Roman world. So he put it to use for ministry. So that's how I will often frame it as, maybe it's coming to the State House to meet your rep, pray with them. But it truly is just another aspect of ministering well. And Paul's call included a call to minister to kings. And, towards the end of the book of Acts, I preached on Acts 26 yesterday. Here he is just laying out a sermon to Herod Agrippa. So I see that as maybe we could recapture that as an aspect of essential ministry, because when I think of discipleship, a friend of mine who ministers in urban Indianapolis has just an incredible ministry there. He defines discipleship as every time you connect with someone, you help them take one step closer to Jesus. Well, that's what you do when you meet with your state rep, your state senator.
And you're so right, the fact that we often have our politics so inverted. I've talked to a lot of people about the fact that whatever happens, whether it's in DC, what the president does, it's like that has little day-to-day bearing on who you are and how your life's going to be lived out. And now certain things do, but more so your local politicians is, your mayor and city council and school board and all that are going to have more of an impact day to day on your life. And so if we can have an impact there, and I just think about people in all of your congregations who, they have been gifted and could run, what are you doing to encourage and support them in those matters that can have a huge impact locally in your community? So when you mentioned that when you came out law school, you talked about the different things that were really shifting things legally, the judgments and things that were coming down. So as you kind of look at things now, and obviously with the last election, a lot has happened, a lot is going on, some positive things, probably some negative things. What would you consider the top 3 legal challenges churches are facing right now in the United States?
So I would paint a picture, or at least attempt to paint a picture, different from perhaps when I was growing up. I often heard kind of this doom and gloom, government is coming for the church. We have to shutter the windows, chain the doors. And there was good reason for that. In fact, especially in the start of the Christian school movement, they literally were chaining church doors over truancy laws. And so that was an accurate reflection of the current political and legal moment. But I think we have to be people of our times and see that currently religious liberty is on a serious win streak at the U.S. Supreme Court, supporting many of the rights. The hire and fire, I'll get into that. Even pastoral speech, the right of Christians to live out their faith in the public square. Now, are there challenges? Will there always be challenges? Yes. But I do want to note that I do think we're in what I've been describing as a Joseph moment, where Joseph, shows up, he's there in Egypt, and without Pharaoh's authority as, a God-ordained institution of government, everyone would have died. Without Joseph's favor and wisdom, everyone would have died. And so there's this ancient example of these two organizations, institutions working together, and I've never seen a better opportunity for these two institutions to work together like they were designed to do than right now. Now, that can quickly go off the rails, but I did just want to note, often in something like this, it's very fear-based. Government's coming for you. You got to get this done right now, or you're going to lose your tax-exempt status or something. I think we need to look at these things. We need to have a solid foundation, but also just wanted to thank God for the moment that we find ourselves in, where you can get up, pastor, on Sunday morning, and you can preach about biblical principles, and you do not have to be afraid of losing your tax-exempt status. You don't have to be afraid, like brothers and sisters around the world, of a SWAT team showing up at your front door. So we often criticize our government because that's our birthright as Americans, right? But I did want to at least, we're to give thanks when things like these develop. And so I did want to mention that. Now, the challenges that I would see currently are aimed at the employment arena. So certainly churches have the right to hire and fire their staff based upon adherence to the religious belief. All right, this applies across society. So if you could imagine as an ordained Christian pastor, if I walked into a mosque or if I walked into a temple of some Eastern religion and I said, I want to be either an imam or I want to be a leader in your congregation, they obviously have the have the right to say, no, you don't, you're not going to work because you don't adhere to our beliefs. This is a clear First Amendment right. But what happened in 2020 was a case called Bostock. It was written by Justice Gorsuch, and many conservative legal scholars still have their jaws on the ground that he wrote this. And essentially what Bostock did is it said that the word sex in Title VII, which is the Civil Rights Act referring to employment, that the word sex in the sense that you cannot discriminate based on sex. That word sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, when that was drafted back in the 1960s, very few people had any idea of the extent to which that would impact public life. And yet that is what that decision held. And most importantly for ministries, Gorsuch essentially said, we leave for another day how this impacts religious organizations. So it's like, well, thanks a lot.
Exactly.
And so a few weeks later, the Supreme Court turned around in what was called the Lady of Guadalupe case and strengthened what is called the ministerial exception. And this might be worth the price of admission, even though it's free. All right, guys. If there was like one legal protection that I could tell you about, it is this one. And so it's called the ministerial exception. When you first think of it or read of it, it sounds like just a pastor. But the ministerial exception applies to anyone that is preaching, teaching, or communicating the faith. And in fact, in Lady of Guadalupe, it applied to a Christian school teacher. And prior to this, the ministerial exception was very formulaic. And one of the requirements is that you had to have formal religious training. And I joked before that I've read the New Testament a few times, and I have yet to find where Jesus went to seminary. So Jesus himself would not have qualified for the ministerial exception, right?
Right.
So the Supreme Court said, no. It's not about meeting all of this checklist. It is about what you do. So if you are responsible for communicating the faith to the next generation, to congregants, then you are a minister. And in most instances, this can act as a way to dismiss a case outright. Because let's say somebody comes to your church, you hire them as a pastor, or you hire them in a capacity where they're praying or ministering with people. That could be a student pastor, a worship leader, etc. And I'll explain kind of the extent of it in a minute. And let's say they go out and they do something contrary to your statement of faith. You fire them for that. Maybe they're not following the biblical sexual ethic, and they come and try to bring a suit against your church. Well, you can say, ministerial exception, dismiss this case. And oftentimes that's exactly what happens. That's how strong it is. It is the strongest legal protection available to ministries. The problem is the cases are still being litigated at the edge of the ministerial exception. So what about a janitor? What about an individual that just cooks lunch at a Christian school? Those are the cases that are still a bit up in the air. Now, there have been some good developments. Just recently, World Vision won a case, and the individual in question was essentially a donor relations specialist. But the ministry said, look, this individual prays with our donors. They communicate the faith. They're an essential part of our ministry. And this was the Ninth Circuit. All right, the Ninth Circuit is known as the very liberal circuit, often going against Christian beliefs. But the Ninth Circuit actually sided with World Vision and said this person was a ministerial position. World Vision, you win, no discrimination, and case over. So that's how powerful it is. But the question is, what about the janitor? What about the cook in the kitchen? My belief, strongly, is that the First Amendment protects a ministry in every situation, and any staff and any volunteer saying you have to abide by our statement of faith. But that's kind of where it's being litigated right now. And I'll mention this perhaps again before we're done, but this interview does not constitute an attorney-client relationship, so I encourage folks to consult with counsel. But you probably don't have to think too hard about, well, what should we do in our key responsibility areas in our employment documents? And most of the time, it's not dreaming up some spiritual requirement. It is just memorializing the fact that you expect everyone, includes somebody in the office answering the phone, to be ministering to other people and to assign duties along those lines, so that you're properly reflecting to a reviewing court, no, this is somebody that is communicating the faith. So that's number one. And I think there's also a great opportunity for churches to jump in and update documents reflecting the strength of that protection. Let me pause there before I jump into the others, see if you had any feedback.
It was just a day or two ago that a headline came across my feed, and I'm trying to remember the exact thing that it was. I think maybe it had to do with a college, and the court came back and ruled in favor of the college in this same manner. But I didn't read the article to see exactly what it was talking about. So it's just interesting that, like you're saying, it just keeps coming through that they're siding with, our faith and protecting that.
That's correct. And so a college, a Christian school, you would think, oh, maybe only a church could claim this ministerial exception. But no, this was World Vision. So you're right.
Yeah.
You do not have to be a church. You have to be a religious organization to grab that. So the second piece of it is parental rights. Now you think, well, that's not directly impacting the church, but actually I think it does.
Yeah.
I assisted a family, Mary and Jeremy Cox, who lost custody of their son because they could not in good conscience affirm his transgender identity. After 5 months, 5 months after the case started, the state of Indiana dismissed all allegations against them. But despite them providing for every need, physical, educational, etc., the state kept him out of their home for more than 2 years and never returned him until he aged out. Essentially, as long as he claimed that if he went back to his safe family's home, so the state said this is a safe home, these parents haven't abused or neglected their child in any way, but he would say, if you put me back there, I'm not going to eat. And as long as that occurred, the court would never put him back. We appealed that all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court did not end up taking it. So we turned around this last year in Indiana and passed a law, first in the country, saying referring or raising your child consistent with their biological sex cannot be considered neglect or abuse. So, but that's here. I recently had on Pastor Tate Thronson from Colorado, because Colorado had proposed the opposite of that. And now in Colorado code, it says if you dead name, meaning you use the name that you put on your child's birth certificate, you will be guilty of discrimination in the state of Colorado.
That's crazy.
And that's being challenged. So pastor may think, well, that's not directly affecting our corporation, but we're partnering with parents to raise their kids up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, right?
Right.
And I think in Pastor Thronson is an incredible example of this. He went with his church people to say, we can't sit here on Sunday and say a parent has the right and then the spiritual responsibility to raise their child consistent with the Bible, and then kind of stand by while a parent could literally lose custody of their kid over teaching exactly what we preach and teach on Sunday. Further, say you're a Christian school and a parent is investigated over this by the Child Welfare Agency. And let me pause for just a minute. I think everybody gets what's happening here, but most of us are familiar with, Department of Child Services, Cabinet for Health and Family Services, whatever the name of that is in your state. An allegation of abuse is made, they show up, they have the power to take a kid. Yeah. That's what we're talking about. Raising your kid consistent to Scripture, saying we're not going to use a name that's the contrast with your biological sex. You're born a boy, we're going to raise you as a boy. That being considered abuse. Yeah. And that getting your kid pulled out. So that is, for me, the one where the woods are on fire. And this is being actively pushed. And like a lot of issues these days, like I mentioned, Indiana passed one direction. Colorado went the other direction. So depending on where you are, this could be a real challenge. And the Supreme Court has not taken a significant parental rights case in about a quarter century. So that's the problem. If if you confuse the idea that non-affirmation, so not referring to a child, according to their transgender ideology, equals abuse or neglect, you can get the entire weight of the child welfare state in your state coming down on a Christian family. So that's why I say, and maybe that should be number one, but it's not as perhaps as direct at the church, but it could be a pastor and his family. And why wouldn't they be the one that was targeted? Because they're the one preaching it.
Yeah.
So this is the type of stuff, when I first got into this, I thought, no way, surely they're not going there. But sure enough, they are. I was able to work with a working group of attorneys from Heritage Foundation, and there is now a model bill. And this is an interesting issue because we have had unexpected allies in this struggle, folks that know who we are, we don't hide who we are, but self-described radical feminists who would say, I define myself as a woman attracted to a woman. You're now changing the transgender piece of LGBTQ is now challenging that. If you can just claim to be a woman, and so some of the days I'm thinking, oh my goodness, trying to figure out how all this works out. But that's led to some really interesting conversations. So we think perhaps even in some states, the terminology of blue or purple, where you wouldn't think that more maybe conservative or legislation based on biblical principles might make it through. Perhaps on this one, there's an opportunity. So that's been a drum that I've been beating for a couple years. It is one, again, just the woods are on fire.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of glad you brought that up, because I know, like, for me, I see things that are happening on a national scale, like, for instance, with the whole Riley Gaines issue and how, they reversed that course to give the medals back and all that. And I think, man, it feels like maybe some sanity is returning, but in a lot of these places, it still is a really big issue.
So I do think we're seeing the uncommon return of common sense, where one of my friends called it a renaissance of the created order. He's a seminary professor, so he gets to use those
Sounds
words.
like it.
However, there's a question as to how deeply that goes beyond, and I'm grateful for leadership, cultural leadership, political leadership, taking those stands, but it also has to be cultural. And I do think there's a lot of pushback, and this is certainly not over, not a time to kind of rest and sit. Rather, I see it as an opportunity where possible, go ahead and get into black letter law, or we need the court cases that double down and support this. So that's where we really need the church's moral voice to just, and this one's to me, it's not a real hard one, right? Like if there is any issue I can point to where the legal / political has invaded the spiritual, when the state comes in and says, you're teaching a biblical principle, we're taking your child away. I can't think of a clearer example of the invasion of the sacred than that. So that's one I just want to really highlight and underline. As you mentioned, I don't think it's going away. So it's an opportunity to dive in. The third one might not be as apparent, but imagine every pastor listening in has experiences or has the stories, or just wait, you'll have them. But that would be internal division. And so why is that a legal challenge to a church? Because as you're trying to lead folks, having done this for a while now, I have seen all sorts of bad behavior by individuals challenging what I think is biblical authority. And so oftentimes, this comes back to the articles, it comes back to the bylaws. I know people start talking about those documents and eyes roll back into heads, and like you said, pastors are so busy. But oftentimes in those documents, how the church actually operates is not properly memorialized. And one key thing that I talk to pastors about is making sure that the spiritual authority of the church, so that would be pastor plus, elders, pastors, deacons. I'll leave that to you in your church governance. Sometimes you start talking about this, and people get heated. But I think, look at Acts 6. I mean, there is clearly spiritual authority outlined in the model for the church, and there's accountability to the members. But many times the corporate and legal authority are not matched. So a lot of churches will have language of trustees. Trustees generally are going to be an outdated legal term from before churches could incorporate, often carried over into church documents. But here's the problem. Let's say you have a pastor and then you have deacons. And the deacons in this particular church are vested, in a serving role, but also in a leading role. And the document says that all, legal authority is vested in the board of trustees, which is the deacons. Well, they now have the authority to sell the property. They now, if there's ever a dispute, a court that reviews that document is going to look at that group as the legal directors directing the affairs of the corporation. Well, that doesn't in any way match the spiritual authority. And sometimes what I've seen happen is there's like, well, pastor, you preach. We do the quote unquote business of the church. Well, that's about as unbiblical as anything I've ever heard. I mean, it's all together, right? It's spiritual leadership. So in those documents, you're certainly wanting to update your statement of faith, the current legal issues, current cultural issues, saying that the pastor plus other spiritual leaders are the ones that get to interpret doctrine if there's ever a challenge. Because what about artificial intelligence and pornography and sex robots and all the crazy... you think about 5 years ago, who knew we'd be here?
Seriously.
So who gets to make that call? Plus making sure that the pastor plus the deacons or the elders, however your church is governed, that they are tied to the corporate leadership of the church, so that there can't be what I often term an unholy hijack. Just one other thing, most churches have dealt with this by now, but allowing people that are not vested in the life and ministry of the church to vote on key provisions because their name's on some membership roll, and out of fear of upsetting one, they haven't been scrubbed. That can also cause a huge problem. So there are these cultural issues that are big and flashy, that are big concerns, but I'll tell you in my work, what I often see distracts ministries and steers them away, causes splits, is often not in a time of maybe not complete peace, but in a time when there's not a huge blow up or division in the church, going back to that foundation and making sure that's squared away. I see that as a real problem.
Now, when you talk about constitution bylaws, a lot of pastors have never done it, don't know what to do. Is that something Good Citizen Project can help with, or do you have somebody that you can kind of recommend that, hey, if you need some help in work bolstering these things, this is what we can do?
No, they're on their own. No, I'm just joking. This is something I do not know how many church bylaws I have looked at. I think about cross-eyed at this point. But that is something that we assist with in the partnership process. And I don't necessarily wake up every morning thinking, yay, I get to review a church's document. However, I do know how important it can be to the life of a church. And getting those things right so the church can get on that solid foundation and then impact its community. So I look at it as kind of getting a strong foundation from which you then can impact your zip code. So we do that through a partnership program that's tiered based on number of people attending, but we don't leave folks out to dry. There's certainly are a number of great legal ministries out there, but we're certainly happy, and we take a lot of joy in helping ministries with that.
Well, and I'll just say from this side, from the pastor's chair, like how much it means to have people like you come along and help us with things like that, because, it's not my area of expertise. And so helping to relieve that stress and that burden is huge for us. So I know we appreciate it. You kind of touched a little bit on, some of the issues and mistakes that churches can make. And I just kind of want to throw this out to you. What do you think are some of the most common legal mistakes that you see churches make, and how can they be avoided before they become costly problems?
First one, report child abuse. Report
Yes.
allegations of child abuse, please.
Yeah.
And you look around the United States, you look at some of the history even of the independent Baptist movement, and we should be leading in protecting vulnerable women and children. And instead, the rap that the church often gets in broader public life is that we have not done that well. And I think part of it is a piece of public theology that I think perhaps more influenced by, I don't know, maybe influenced by Scripture and movements of the church, but maybe influenced some by just our American Christianity, in that we look at government, we say, government, boo, bad. Like you stay out of this, you have no role here. This is an ecclesiastical matter. Well, let's not forget 1 Peter 2. It says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man, to the king is supreme, under governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of them that do well. Government's job is to punish evil. It is to maintain order. And so when a crime is committed, the state has a valid biblical role. And so I'm not quite sure how sometimes we have lost that. In most states are going to say, you have, if you hear of an allegation of neglect, you have that responsibility to report it. There are some states that have a clergy penitent privilege that you need to double check. But generally it's going to be, you hear this, you call immediately, even if it gets screened out, meaning you call the child welfare agency, you tell them, here's the allegation. They may not go investigate it, but you either get the name of an individual, you get a report number, and that goes in a file in your church, because if 15 years from now, that young woman that was in the youth group that made that report against a youth pastor or a worker comes back either in the news or due to statute of limitations being extended, comes back with a lawsuit, you have that in the file. And so that so often, to me, it's beyond an unforced error. And I'm not quite sure why that was the culture in the church of just, sending that pastor on to the next place and then telling the young woman, please don't make a big deal about it. Because we've seen how that impacts their view of God and their view of the church. And so it's...
Well, and it's...
Go ahead.
It's like across the religious board, too. It's like Southern Baptist, it's Methodist, it's Catholics, like all have this same idea of we got to protect the church or the ministry, and we fail to protect these lives that are underneath us.
And I will say, my general take on this is that if in doubt, report. And so you look at the definition of abuse, you look at the allegation. Again, if this is something that's going on right now, pick up the phone and call an attorney today. But if in doubt, report. But then there is also something called due process, in that anyone can make an allegation against anyone. The church is not the court. The church is not DCS, Department of Child Services. And so the church participates with the authority as this other God-ordained institution, moves to protect those in the church, but even for an employee, maybe that's an unpaid leave, but not just maybe going out and throwing them under the bus. If somebody's made an allegation, we just accept it as true right away. Right. So there's a proper way to handle these things, but that to me is the unforced error. And then on another missed opportunity, if you have not done so, is going ahead and updating those employment documents, as I discussed earlier. Okay. Of being able to say, here's our key responsibility areas, here's our job description for a Christian school teacher or a preschool teacher, a youth pastor, a worship leader, that they're communicating the faith to the next generation, that they're expected to pray, and in the law, the sacerdotal functions or ordinances, if that's something that a pastor would do, and going ahead and getting that into documents. One other just unforced error, maybe pastors haven't heard of this one, is if you have incorporated as a church, there's a document called the Articles of Incorporation. And a lot of churches just think about their bylaws. And so, I'm just going to redo my bylaws. In most states, if the articles and the bylaws conflict, it's like a legal game of rock, paper, scissors, the articles will control.
Okay.
And so and a lot of times articles were filed back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yep.
Nobody's looked at them in years. But if push comes to shove and there's a contention, and there's an example of this in my state of a Christian university having a dispute between the president and the board, and the articles spoke clearly to the issue. When someone discovered the articles, they filed them into this lawsuit over, because the articles controlled over the bylaws. So it's an opportunity to go back to that document as well, to hardwire in your religious purpose statement, a little bit of your church governance. So in a sense, there's a second line of legal defense. So those to me are just some issues that I think churches can dive into.
Okay. So this is not my world. I don't claim to know anything. So when you're talking about the articles and redoing those, how difficult of a process is that to update and make sure that those are, where they need to be?
Not significant. Generally, a copy of those, a copy of that document can be found on the Secretary of State's website or similar agency in your state, and they can be updated. They're generally going to be much shorter, much more bare bones. Think of kind of a legal skeleton or legal DNA, and then filed back with the Secretary of State. So there is a filing requirement, but generally it's just a small fee, and it is not too extensive of a process.
Gotcha. Excellent. So one of the things I did want to ask you about, with the rise of online ministry, live streaming, digital content, what intellectual property and copyright issues should churches keep in mind?
Well, the first one, of course, is going to be proper licensing for Sunday services. Many are familiar with CCLI and the reporting requirement there.
Yeah.
Another one would just be being very careful about taking stock images off of the internet and using them. There are firms that literally have, I think, AI-assisted crawlers going through the internet, seeing if you've improperly used a photo on the website or online. So being careful of those. Copyright.gov is if you are creating materials, let's say you're creating curriculum, more user-friendly than you might expect. And generally there is, if you've created it, you've probably seen the copyright symbol, you can employ that. Again, I do encourage you to reach out to an attorney about this if you're creating a significant amount of curriculum, music, etc. And then for trademark, again, we're just barely scratching the surface here. I would say that generally looking to trademark a name or a logo, if it would be devastating to the ministry to lose the sole use of that in a sense, the marketplace or in ministry. And that's one where it can be expensive, but it certainly is worth hiring an attorney to help you get that trademark done and then to maintain it. So those are just a few thoughts on maintaining that. If you are kind of first to use something, you do have kind of a general usage of that you can claim. The problem is you just have to prove it. And that's where the actual trademark comes in, where you can say, no, we filed this, and therefore other ministry, other author, you can't take my intellectual property. So those are just a few thoughts.
Okay. So a couple things before we round out the episode. We've got a lot of small, mid-sized churches, often without in-house legal counsel. So how can they go about accessing the resources they need to stay legally compliant and protected?
So we have a legal partnership program that is, we think, affordable. And when I started, I kind of started with a model of kind of Christian missionary, we'll just do it for donations. But I quickly learned, I assisted a church redid their entire documents. I called them up, and they said, we decided that we didn't need that. And so I decided that I needed to have the church have a little bit of skin in the game to make sure that this was going to be a mutually beneficial process. And so we started the partner program, and again, based on enrollment, but it's in 3 tiers that runs from $97 a month up to $247 a month. And it's based on generally it's a year that we do that. But then if a church is interested in kind of a rolling general counsel relationship, that can continue. So that's been, I tell people it's not pro bono, it's kind of low bono. It's a term
exactly.
where we want, through the collective resources of the church and through donor support, we want to make that accessible to the church. But that's kind of where we've landed in our approach, that we want it to be something that the church is paying for, kind of like it is not insurance, but kind of in the sense that a church pays for hazard insurance and other things. To look at this as something that, especially as a church grows, it has more community ministries, it has a school, someone that they can pick up the phone and call and is ready to answer if there's a concern.
Which is so great. And anybody who's had to do anything, in the legal system understands like how affordable what you're offering is, which I think is so great because literally a majority of the churches are like 60 people at that. And so you can't necessarily keep somebody on retainer like that, but to have a resource like you're offering is huge. And much appreciated. Now, we don't look into crystal balls because we're Christians, but if I'm going to ask you to just look ahead with what you know and what you're seeing and just kind of tell us, what do you think are some emerging legal issues that you believe churches will need to address over the next 5 to 10 years, and what do you think they can do to start preparing right now?
So certainly parental rights is one that I just want to raise to the forefront, something that is going to be an issue. Something else, and this is an interesting development, is what about pastoral speech and even preaching and even endorsing a candidate from the pulpit? Now, my approach, I'm not a huge fan of political punditry from the pulpit. My personal approach is to preach biblical principles, encourage people to use their citizenship and vote according to biblical values, give them solid information. And I would defer to a pastor in his conscience on that. But tying nonprofit status to not saying anything about a candidate has been unconstitutional from the beginning. And there was a consent motion filed in a case that clarified that and said, look, a pastor communicating in a church communicating with the congregation related to even candidates does not run afoul of the Internal Revenue Code. So I celebrate that in the sense that if I have ever seen anything used to chill the role of conscience of the church and the pastors, just preaching the word of God from the pulpit, it has been this. And I can't tell you how many pastors I've talked to that are, I can't say anything because of tax exempt status. Like, no, that's a pre-political biblical principle, like the sanctity of life. Like that's right. The church or the state doesn't get to tell you what to say about that. And you're not even close to saying vote for or vote against when you're preaching about the sanctity of life. But it is so commonly misunderstood. That has actually, a judge has not issued a ruling in that case. The Internal Revenue Service just said, we agree this is how the code should be interpreted. So I think that's going to be, a challenge coming up for pastors where maybe a pastor has been concerned about speaking out. Well, you should preach on biblical principles, and you do so without fear. There may be some pressure from political groups to do that more. And I think a pastor is going to have to navigate that through election season. And we do our best to provide some materials to help pastors navigate that in a biblical way. But that is certainly one that I see coming. Also, this employment issue as it relates to, say, a janitor or a cook. We see some positive indicators, but our prayer is that these wins continue. As kind of a closing thought, I often will tell church leaders, two things. One, define what you intend to defend. In preparation for these cases, over and over and over again, there are questions as to maybe like the sincerity of a person's religious beliefs because they they wavered, they go back and forth on what they believe. No, you just put in your here's who we are, here's what we believe. We are only going to perform wedding ceremonies for those consistent with our faith. The U.S. Supreme Court has put that in black letters, a black letter law. Here's what we believe about marriage and about human sexuality. So you have to define what you intend to defend. And if all of us do that, that helps strengthen these religious liberty protections in public life. But then the second thing I say, which is really the one I would like to leave listeners with, is I often say the best way to defend religious freedom is to use it. Best way to defend religious freedom is to use it. And so you look at all of these things, one of the opportunities that we have, especially now, is begin building those relationships with our governing officials, advocating for what is true, good, and beautiful. And so if one of these things happens to your church, or someone comes or put something in the news media, maybe even you have a lawsuit come against you, you already have connections with folks, and you've pre-planned for that. And so that when that say a summons comes in the mail, it's not the end of the world. You're connected with folks in the public square, and you have done the hard work of becoming a partner in the community, so that when somebody say comes after your church for holding to biblical beliefs, but is just slamming you for those beliefs, like, no, that church was the one that was out serving at the homeless shelter, like that. There may be some advocates out there that'll come and scream at you, but the general community, through your good works, is going to glorify God in heaven. And so I just wanted to drill down less a kind of fear-based, you have to do this but more of a opportunity-based. Scripture tells us to get outside of our walls to make a difference, and we have a really unique opportunity in the United States to do that. And hopefully we can come alongside and just provide some resources as churches do that in their own zip code.
Well, I sure appreciate your approach, Josh. If people have questions or they want to invite you to come speak at their church, what's the best way they can reach out to you?
So over at www.goodcitizen.us, our podcast is there, access to small group resources, speaking, also the legal partnerships. Or certainly feel free to reach out to me personally via email, josh@goodcitizen, altogether there, josh@goodcitizen.us. Would welcome an opportunity to communicate there.
You can reach us here at the Pastors Connection Network by going to pastorsconnectionnetwork.com or finding us on Facebook at Pastors Connection Network. Josh, I sure appreciate you coming on. I just want to give you an extended open invitation that as legal things come up that might be of concern to pastors in their churches or their families, feel free to reach out so we can have a conversation about it and just make sure people are aware. But I appreciate you giving us your time and expertise today.
I appreciate your focus, Thomas, on the local church, connecting and resourcing pastors in this, I think, important cultural moment, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Thank you for joining us on the Pastors Connection podcast. May you be inspired and equipped to lead with grace and purpose until we meet again.